Um, uh, Great to be with you. So tens of thousands of years ago, before the invention of writing, our ancestors were busy in caves around the world, creating abstract signs, painting images that still have the power to grip and move us today. And in this lecture, we're going to think about this art, the art of the Stone Age, consider some of the profound scientific, philosophical, and theological questions it raises concerning human reality, creativity, and the spiritual quest. And asking, what are some of the implications of this ancient art for Christian mission and witness in today's world? I'm not an expert on the Stone Age. I studied theology, first of all. My doctorate from Oxford was on political theology in the 17th century, actually. And then I've had a weird career. I went into broadcasting. I thought I was going to end up in teaching, didn't go there, ended up in the BBC and was a producer there for many years. But trying to be a Christian broadcaster, trying to do my job with a Christian vision at the very least, even if the subject matter wasn't necessarily particularly Christian. And I've also had the opportunity to teach, as you've just heard, most recently at Regent College, where I taught theology and the arts. And I suppose this is where some of this interest really began. But it goes back before then to the early, to the 1990s, really. I became interested in cave art after reading about the discovery of the Chauvet cave in southeastern France in the mid-1990s. It was discovered by a group of experienced potholers led by a guy called Jean-Marie Chauvet, after whom the cave was named. And it was immediately recognized as a site of major scientific and archaeological significance. Just want to show you an image of this. It's never been open to the public, this cave, in order to protect it for future generations. But photographs of the cave soon began to be published, and there's now even a replica of the place that you can visit. I was struck not only by the incredible age of these images, some of them date back more than 30,000 years ago, but also by their extraordinary beauty and energy. A lot of commentators have been impressed by the way in which the artists have tried to capture the movement of animals, and have even described a number of the Chauvet paintings as attempted animations. When I first saw this stunning image of 4 horses, I thought it was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. 30,000 years old, and I still think that. But there are so many beautiful and stunning images, like this engraving of a horse that is, it's actually drawn in the rock itself, engraved in the rock, scraped from the rock face. And it's so confidently and elegantly achieved, packed with life and movement. I began finding out about other caves and their wonderful contents. There are examples of cave paintings in many different parts of the world, including a recently discovered cave in Sulawesi in Indonesia, with images that have been dated to about 40,000 years ago. These are the oldest yet found. So this is a goat, I think, and the various human hands that you see there, of course. But the biggest concentration of decorated images discovered thus far is in Europe. This bison is from Altamira in northern Spain. It was discovered in 1879. This was the first real discovery of cave art. But it was discovered by an 8-year-old girl, the daughter of an amateur archaeologist who was digging there in the floor of the cave. He was digging in the floor of the cave, right? She wandered around looking up at the ceiling and discovered 25 multi-chrome images of bison like this one. And it's remarkable that many of the important discoveries of cave paintings in Europe involve children, Probably the most famous discovery of them all was at Lascaux in the Dordogne region of France, and it was made by a group of schoolboys in 1940. It was an absolutely stunning find, a cave packed with skillful, beautiful, and intriguing images. And like many other people, I've become fascinated by what we're learning from all of these caves about the central role that art has played in human culture since the very beginning, and its intimate relationship with spiritual and religious concerns. Stop the share at this point. Come back to our main screen here. Over the last few years, my wife and I have been privileged to visit a few of the caves that are still open in France, still open to the public. Many of them have been closed, as I say, for these reasons of protecting the chemistry of the caves. But we've been able to visit a few of them, including the spectacular cave of Peshmerl in the Lot region of France. And I'm going to be talking about this cave a little later. It's Peshmerl, which I'm going to focus on really in this lecture. Back in 1925, the English writer, art critic, and Christian apologist G.K. Chesterton published The Everlasting Man, which is regarded as one of the best of his books. The Everlasting Man is an interpretation of human history written in response to what Chesterton saw as the crude and materialistic understandings offered by contemporary writers like H.G. Wells. Wells, who was actually a friend of Chesterton's, had published his own outline of history in 1920, and it was a bestseller. It presented the human story as a steady evolution from primitive animality through to enlightened rationality, and it was dismissive of religion and the Christian faith in particular as having little place in a world increasingly shaped by science and technology. So in this intellectual climate, Chesterton wanted to persuade his readers to think again about Christianity, to take a fresh look at what it represents and what it's contributed to the world. He believed that just as the Christian church seems to grow more remarkable when it's fairly compared with the common religious life of mankind, so mankind itself seems to grow more remarkable when we compare it with the common life of nature. He was convinced that when seen in the proper perspective, both Christianity and humanity stand out from their background, like, as he put it, supernatural things. The Everlasting Man is aimed at secular, skeptically minded people, and it has a profoundly missional intent. Significantly, the book begins with a chapter entitled The Man in the Cave. Chesterton, like many of his well-read, well-educated contemporaries, was aware of the amazing discoveries of prehistoric art that were being made in Europe, and he made use of them to challenge popular versions of evolutionary theory. He told the story of a priest and a boy who together had explored the system of underground passageways and chambers and had discovered many remarkable paintings of animals on the walls of the caves. What exactly did their findings reveal? He asked. Certainly, there was no evidence of the brutish, violent, and primitive caveman of crude evolutionism, a being barely distinguishable from the animals. That was the kind of picture that folks like H.G. Wells were painting. If someone had told the priest and the boy that the pictures had all been drawn by St. Francis of Assisi, Chesterton said, out of pure and saintly love of animals, there would be nothing in the caves to contradict it. On the contrary, in their subterranean explorations, the priest and the boy were confronted by art that was skillful and brilliantly made by people who were clearly human beings just like them. And they instinctively understood themselves to be united with these people in a bond of brotherhood across the abyss of ages, as Chesterton put it. But when all is said and done, he argued, the main fact that the evidence of the reindeer men, these Ice Age artists, demonstrates, along with all other records, is that the reindeer man could draw and the reindeer could not. Chesterton wasn't denying the scientific theory of evolution and the unimaginably long processes involved. Rather, he was rejecting a reductionist and one-dimensional version of this, a one-dimensional approach to human existence, and emphasizing the utterly unique features that differentiate human beings from all other species. The simplest lesson to learn in the cavern of the colored pictures, Chesterton maintained, is that human beings do differ from the animals in kind and not in degree. Something of division and disproportion has appeared, and it is unique. Art is the signature of man. I think Chesterton is onto something really important here in this notion of art as the signature of man. Various people have picked up on it, but I think it's something that matters hugely in any discussion of human identity and the human future. It matters very much in the modern world within the context of scientific discovery and experimentation, but also in any theological consideration of cultures and beliefs throughout history and across the globe. So what did Chesterton mean by insisting that art is the human signature? I want to tease out some of the implications of this idea by looking at a number of Stone Age paintings, and at one in particular from the cave that is at the very center of Chesterton's story. Because Chesterton's tale of the priest and the boy wasn't a fiction. He didn't make it up. Although he didn't identify it by name, he was clearly referring to the discovery in 1922, just 3 years before the publication of The Everlasting Man, of the painted cave of Peshmerl in the Lot region of France. On 20th of October 1923, the Illustrated News, London News, a weekly publication for which Chesterton had been writing a column for many years, carried a 3-page spread on Peshmerl. Under the headline, Art and Religion, 15,000 years ago, a great prehistoric sanctuary found. This article, which of course was alongside Chesterton's own column in the paper, this article explained how a schoolboy named André Dutort, together with some friends, had gone exploring a local network of caves in search of ancient paintings, and how they'd done so at the urging of their parish priest, Amédée Lemazie, who lived from 1882 to 1970. I'm going to go back to the share of my screen again. And here they are. Father Lemazie was the priest of the village of Cabarets in the village of the Lot. The village of Cabarets in the Lot. He had a serious interest in paleontology and already made a number of important finds of his own. He fired the imaginations of the young people of his parish with stories of the prehistoric peoples who'd once inhabited their region. And he asked them to be on the lookout for telltale signs of their activity. In the days before risk assessments and health and safety concerns, Lemazie even encouraged his youth group to go caving. Can you imagine that? And some of them were so inspired by what they heard that they did just that. André David decided to explore a cave that had been known about locally for generations. And he went off with his friend André Dutort, aimed with only a few candles and a rope. By removing some rubble that barred their way at the back of the cave, they managed to wriggle through to an entirely new and extensive system of passageways and caverns. They reported back to Lemazie on what they'd found, and he returned with them on a number of ill-equipped and often hair-raising explorations underground to make one of the great archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, the painted caves of Peshmerl. containing images that date back at least 25,000 years. Some of them are substantially older than that. Chief among the wonders that they discovered is the panel of the spotted horses. Situated on a large rock in the main cavern of the cave complex, this 4-meter panel, painted with manganese, ochre, and charcoal, is composed of 2 horses facing in opposite directions, a series of black and red dots situated both inside and outside the body of the animals, 6 handprints, 3 right, 3 left, a series of bent thumbprints, and an image of a fish imposed on the horses, superimposed on the horses. On the right of the panel, the artist made use of the natural shape of the rock to suggest the head of one of the horses. And the paleontologist Michel Blanchet, who is the leading expert on this painting, maintains that it was the shape of the rock itself that triggered the development of the whole panel. That's what started it. The artist saw that shape and thought, oh, a horse. And lo and behold, this work of art came out of that. Images like this are evidence of what some anthropologists and archaeologists refer to as a creative explosion that occurred in the Upper Paleolithic period. Now, the Upper Paleolithic period, I'm using this word various times, but it's the Stone Age, the Paleolithic. The Upper Paleolithic is the late Stone Age, which lasted from about 50,000 years ago to 11,000 years ago. It's the Ice Age, basically, in the Northern Hemisphere. And it goes from 50,000 to 11,000 when the Ice Age ends. And the Upper Paleolithic art that we're looking at, and this explosion that they're referring to, is right at the beginning of this period. After immense periods of time in which nothing appears to have changed in human culture, evolution, and activity, suddenly, 40,000 years ago, in the archaeological record, there is evidence of an incredible flourishing of art, technology, and religion. The cutting ability and efficiency of tools was greatly improved, for example. Bone, antler, and ivory began to be shaped and used extensively. Spear throwers were invented, which dramatically improved the accuracy and power of the hunters. Innovation also occurred in social practices and rituals. The practice of burying the dead with grave goods, food, clothing, and tools seems to have become widespread at this time. And of course, this is precisely the point when cave art also began to appear. All of this amounts to what John Pfeiffer describes in his book by the same name as the creative explosion. Art came with a bang as far as the archaeological record is concerned, he says. There's nothing to foreshadow its emergence, no sign of crude beginnings. Art came with a bang, a big bang. There's some debate about the dating and even the reality of the creative explosion. There are certainly signs of human artistry and ingenuity well before the time of the so-called creative explosion. But this earlier evidence is really quite limited, whereas now there's a massive evidence from various parts of the world pointing to something extraordinary happening in human consciousness around 40,000 years ago. The anthropologist Ian Tattersall argues that symbolism lies at the very heart of what it means to be human. For if there's one single thing that distinguishes humans from all other life forms, it's the capacity for symbolic thought. The ability to generate complex mental symbols and to manipulate them into new combinations. This is the very foundation of imagination and creativity, he says. of the unique ability of humans to create a world in the mind and to recreate it in the real world outside themselves. The unique ability of humans to create a world in the mind and to recreate it in the real world outside themselves, to communicate it to others, in other words. The cave paintings are dramatic evidence of the emergence of something unique in the world, the human ability to create and make widespread use of signs and symbols and images, and to use them both internally and externally in communication with others to reflect on the meaning of their lives. Tattersall points out that as far as we know, we're alone in nature in being able to contemplate our place within it. So what do paintings like the panel of the painted horses tell us? What was the purpose of this monumental work in the center of a chamber deep underground? When prehistoric paintings were first discovered in the 19th century, there was a strong tendency to see them in very modern terms as art for art's sake. Edward Lartet, the 19th century French anthropologist, believed that prehistoric art was the product of leisure in a society where food was plentiful. People started painting for no other reason than that they had the time and the energy and the inclination to do so. There was food everywhere, easily got, massive herds of bison and so on, reindeer. Go get, eat. This theory about the rise of art in the Upper Paleolithic has largely been abandoned for reasons that will be considered in a moment. I mean, it clearly wasn't just a leisure activity. But I think that there has to be an element of truth to this art for art's sake explanation. The desire to make art can and often does spring up spontaneously out of our engagement with the world, an instinctive response to the beauty and vibrancy of life. And in the incredible stories, in the incredible studies of animals on the walls of Altamira, Lascaux, Chauvet, and other places, I think we see plenty of evidence of that. Lartet's notion of art for art's sake also introduces another important dimension of art that can't be left out of consideration. And that's the whole notion of play. In some mysterious way, art represents a move away from the world of necessity and utility to that of freedom and grace. The French writer and art critic Georges Bataille claimed that there have been two capital events in the course of human history: the making of tools with which work began, and the making of art objects with which play began. According to Bataille, it's play that humanizes the world through art. It frees us from the oppressive yoke of grim necessity, and in some way brings us nearer that marvelous heritage for which every one of us feels born. In making this link with play, Bataille is pointing to art as much more than a leisure activity. It's not art for art's sake in any kind of modern, self-indulgent way, but the desire of the person to create, to make and lift up a sign that speaks out of the depth of their own existence. It's not utilitarian in any work-related sense, but it clearly does have some real purpose as an act of communication and fellowship. The gratuitous nature of the sign is an indication that it's not for anything. Art is not for anything in the sense of normal instrumental means. It's simply a creative and free outpouring of exuberant life in response to life itself. Lartet's theory about art for art's sake didn't hold sway for long, mainly because it simply didn't account for the reality of what was being found. Some of the locations where parietal or cave art was discovered were not and never had been places of leisure or human habitation. They were in deep, often dangerous locations, far from well-lit cave entrances and living areas. And the obvious question, as David Lewis Williams points out in his book, The Mind in the Cave, why would these people make works of art in inaccessible, dark, underground places? The seemingly obvious fact that art is made to be looked at is contradicted by deep Upper Paleolithic cave art. Father Lemosy, the priest who discovered Peshmerl, criticized Lartey's idea that prehistoric art was only a hobby corresponding to an easy and idle life. He wasn't having any of that. On his extraordinary explorations underground, Lemosy was struck by the shrine-like quality of Peshmerl, the way in which its spaces seemed to be organized in a similar fashion to the churches and chapels of his own experience. He noted that certain images and engravings were located in such a way as almost to demand a posture of kneeling and obeisance from the observer. The explorer instinctively baptizes these underground places, he wrote, so full of grandeur and mystery, by the name of sanctuaries. And it seemed to him, as he put it, that a religious soul animates the Paleolithic cave. A religious soul animates the Paleolithic cave. Lemosy referred to his discovery as the cave temple of Peshmerl. That's the title of his book in French, actually, The Cave Temple of Peshmerl. And he published that in 1929. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen for a moment. And tell you about this guy. Lemosy was deeply influenced by the pioneering work of Henri Breuil, 1877 to 1961, who, as well as being the first acknowledged authority on cave art, was a Jesuit priest and known by the punning title of the father of prehistory. Breuil's major work on the caves of France, 400 Centuries of Cave Art, published in 1952, is still an important text and a fundamental point of reference for scholars today. Breuil described Peshmerl as he visited it shortly after it was discovered. Lemosy invited him there, and Breuil described it as the Sistine Chapel of the Lot region of France. It's a very telling phrase, precisely because it suggests that the space in which it's found has a fundamentally sacred significance. Building on 19th century and 20th century anthropological studies of living tribal peoples around the world, Breuil argued that the Paleolithic paintings must be seen in the context of some kind of ritual that he called hunting magic. He saw them as being directly related to ceremonies, probably including dancing and the ritual wearing of animal skins and masks, in which the animals are summoned together so that they can be hunted for food. According to this theory, through art and ritual, the animals are magically drawn to the hunting grounds, and thus the supply of food is ensured for the survival of the people. Breuil's theory about hunting magic doesn't meet with wide acceptance today for one simple reason. Archaeological study has proved that the majority of the animal species depicted at Lascaux and other places, we're looking at Breuil at Lascaux here with other scholars, but most of the animals in the paintings weren't part of the diet of Ice Age peoples or regularly used by them for other purposes. So the images simply can't be explained in terms of hunting magic. Nevertheless, Breuil's and Lemosy's insights into the essentially religious nature of the cave paintings have been supported by plenty of other findings. Musical instruments have been found at some of the caves, like this 40,000-year-old flute made from the bone of a bird that was found at Gieschenkloster in Germany. You can still play this, apparently, still make a recognizable tune out of it. And research has shown that prehistoric peoples often chose places of natural resonant sound to paint and draw. Some of these locations, one scholar writes, sound exactly like Romanesque chapels and medieval cathedrals, making it very likely that they were places of ceremony and ritual involving music, chant, and dance. Two of the leading experts on cave art, I've already mentioned one, David Lewis Williams, the other is Jean Clot. They've proposed that what we're seeing in the caves is some form of shamanism, a religious practice still found in different parts of the world. According to this practice, a person called a shaman enters into an altered state of consciousness on behalf of the people in order to do business with the spirit world. The shamans are mediators, and the spirits come to them in animal form. So the shamans often wear animal masks and skins to symbolize this communion with the animals, with the other world. They go to extremely challenging places, including caverns deep underground, where they become ready to communicate with the spirits who come to them through the walls of the cave. Now, it needs to be said that like so much else in prehistory, this shamanistic theory is guesswork. That's all it is at the moment. We don't know. There was no writing. We probably will never know exactly what the people of the caves believed and practiced. But the theory is rooted in some solid evidence. Henri Breuil spent many hundreds of hours in caves documenting and sketching their contents. And this bizarre image became one of his most famous. He called it the Sorcerer, and it's his copy of an engraving at the cave of Les Trois Frères in France. He suggested that what's depicted here is some kind of magician or wizard or shaman in the middle of one of his rituals, attired in his ceremonial regalia of animal mask and the skins. And he seems to have believed that the artist was probably none other than the sorcerer himself. This is known as the Loven Mensch, the lion man, half human, half lion. It's a 12-inch high figure that was carved out of the tusk of a woolly mammoth and has been dated to between 35,000 and 40,000 years ago, which places it among the very oldest pieces of figurative art yet discovered. It's clearly a very creative and striking work of the imagination. But what else is it? It could be that this is a depiction of a god, a local divinity worshipped by the people. Or perhaps it's a character from their mythology, part of a deep story that explained their place in the world. But is it possible that this is a portrayal of a shaman in the midst of an altered state of consciousness, captured in the very act of mediating between the world of the spirits and the world of human beings? So what spiritual and religious significance might the panel of the spotted horses have had for those who painted it, or for the community for which it was intended? Look at that. There's the horses there facing in opposite directions. There are these other elements, and especially these striking hands around the edge, 6 of them, that are very much part of the composition. It's long been known that the handprints on the panel, like so many other handprints in Paleolithic sites across the world, were produced by the spitting or spraying technique. This isn't just dipping your hand in the paint and splashing it on the canvas, as it were, the rock face. This is done by a method in which a negative print is achieved by using the hand as a stencil, spitting or spraying either directly from the mouth or via a tube made from hollowed out bone. It's been shown that the whole work was produced in this way, and not simply the handprints. So if you think those handprints were done by spritting, that's the way the whole thing was done. We'll say some more about this in a moment. Just going to stop the share there. And across many different cultures and historical periods, breath is widely associated with spiritual reality, isn't it? As David Abram points out in his book, The Spell of the Sensuous, nothing is more common to the diverse indigenous cultures of the earth than a recognition of the air, the wind, and the breath as aspects of a singularly sacred power. By virtue of its pervading presence, its utter invisibility, and its manifest influence on all manner of visible phenomena, the air for oral peoples is the archetype of all that is ineffable, unknowable, yet undeniably real and efficacious. It's significant that in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word ruach can mean both spirit and wind, can't it? In the very opening verses of Genesis, we're told that a ruach from God, a wind, the spirit, the very breath of God was moving upon the face of the waters, bringing order out of chaos. In the next chapter, we learn that God formed Adam, the earthy one, from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. In biblical terms, the unbelievable energy and power that brought the cosmos into being is the same as that which gives life to the human being and all other creatures, and is therefore intimately linked with identity and creativity. There's a very real sense in which the panel of the spotted horses at Peshmerl was breathed into existence, and there can be very little doubt about its spiritual and symbolic significance. David Lewis Williams believes that the paintings and carvings of the peoples of the Upper Paleolithic played a vital role in making the spiritual world tangible and material for them. The passageways and chambers of the caverns were places that afforded close contact with, even penetration of a spiritual nether tier of the cosmos. Every image made hidden presences visible. And these weren't just temporary associations. The decorated caves were places that were visited over thousands of years, some of them tens of thousands of years, and they became invested with sacred memory and significance. Sanctuaries, shrines to which people could return time and time again, and within which each image became, as he put it, a kind of reservoir of potency. All of this is very much in line with the insights of Henri Breuil and Amédée Lemaizy. Rudolf Otto's book, The Idea of the Holy or The Idea of the Sacred, argued convincingly that religion can't simply be reduced to rational or moral or sociological categories. There's something irreducible at the heart of genuine religious experience that can only be described with terms like awe, dread, and fear, of being confronted by the mysterium tremendum. It starts, he maintained, from a consciousness of the absolute superiority or supremacy of a power other than myself. This is the sacred. It seems clear that when these ancient peoples went deep underground to create their images, it was in the belief that they were immersed in and surrounded by spiritual power and meaning. To go into such places is, as the Romanian scholar Mircea Eliade suggested in his classic text, The Sacred and the Profane, it's to enter a different space and time, to undergo a journey to the center, to the womb, to the heart of things. In this way, Eliade insisted, the sacred allows people to orient themselves in the world, giving them a map of space and time. It provides them with an educational curriculum, teaching the value of objects, actions, and peoples. It integrates people into community, establishing the meaning of their group, and it seeks to protect and ensure health and well-being by warding off violence and evil. The 6 handprints of the panel of the horses at Peshmerl seem to be connected in important ways with this idea of sacred power. And the idea, the image of the hand is actually ubiquitous in Paleolithic art. You find it many, many different places. We found it in Sulawesi there, didn't we? In that 40,000 years old painting. It's significant. It often has an iconic quality, and its placement in highly prominent places in the caves, at access points, in niches in the rock wall, in juxtaposition with images of animals, as at Peshmerl. All of this adds to a sense of authority, monumentality. It's a complex sign, isn't it? Which must have had many different meanings, including the very simple, but nonetheless poignant, I was here. You know, it's kind of, we still have this instinct, don't we? Whether it's, you know, steam on a window, or, you know, kind of a dirty back window of a car or so, you know, we kind of want to bang our hands on it and make a handprint. I was here. It's uniquely personal. And it's the very first, this is the human signature, if ever there was one, isn't it? It's the first signature or selfie, we might say. It connects us in powerful and moving ways with specific people, specific individuals from 25,000 years ago and more. But in the panel of the spotted horses, the six hands seem to have a rather more problematic and perhaps even ominous meaning. In many different cultures around the world, the hand can carry a strongly magical significance. And this image suggests that some kind of power is being exercised over these animals. Father Lemaizy said in his book, and he believed that this was the case, he said, the arrangement of the hands around the horses allows us to affirm that they were made after the horses and for the horses. The arrangement of the hands made after the horses and for the horses. I think he said that there's a certain relationship between these various elements. And if we consult ethnography, this relationship implies an idea of subjugation or domination. We could say that to a degree, the hand represents the desire for control, the desire to manipulate the world, to handle it and to make it work for us, to subject it in some way to our will. And there's a legitimate aspect to all of that. We engage with the world through our hands, molding it, shaping it, crafting it, trying to bend it to our will, leaving our mark upon it. This is an unavoidable aspect of our humanity, something that sets us apart from the other creatures. We don't tiptoe through the world afraid to leave any footprint or trace of our existence. We're unavoidably makers as well as inhabitants of our environments. But at what point does this legitimate human capacity become arrogant, self-centered, and destructive? The scientist Jacob Bronowski, in his book, The Ascent of Man, comments that all over these caves, the print of the hand says, "This is my mark, this is man." But what kind of mark is it, we ask? What kind of mastery, what kind of power is being exercised here? The breath-infused paintings of horses and hands at Peshmerl provide us with touching evidence of human tenderness, creativity, and spiritual awareness. But they're also pointers to the besetting sins of covetousness and pride, to the sin of Adam and Eve in reaching out to grasp the fruit of the forbidden tree. The brilliant human hand that's capable of so much that is good and beautiful can also be the hand that clutches, that grasps and grabs, and that smashes and steals, that reaches out to strike and to insist, this is mine. Its sixfold presence on the panel of the horses is also a pointer to the distortions, or the deceptions to which human consciousness and spirituality can also be subject. To me, it's remarkable how the characteristics that are identified by scholars as emerging out of the Upper Paleolithic, out of the so-called creative explosion, and that find expression in cave art, they converge so strongly with biblical teaching about human identity. The theologian Wenzel van Heijsteen, in his book Alone in the World, Human Uniqueness in Science and Theology, writes this: the haunting beauty of these prehistoric images and the creative cultural explosion they represent should fascinate any theologian interested in human origins. At first blush, there seems to be a rather remarkable convergence between the evolutionary emergence of Homo sapiens and Christian beliefs about the origins of the human creature. In a sense, the famous cultural explosion of the Upper Paleolithic, more or less 40,000 years ago, although in no historical or evolutionary sense the beginning of a new species, it does exemplify some of the most distinctive traits of our species. Well, as a Christian thinker and apologist of the modern era, I think that G.K. Chesterton was certainly fascinated by the creative explosion. And, just drawing some of these thoughts together, I want to draw a number of the characteristics of the creative explosion that help to confirm his assertion that art is indeed the signature of man. And the first characteristic that I want to draw attention to is that the characteristic of the human signature is the characteristic of wonder. Karl Barth, in his book Evangelical Theology, says something about the origins of theology, which I think also applies to art. A quite specific astonishment stands at the beginning of every theological perception, inquiry, and thought, he said. This astonishment is indispensable if theology is to exist and be perpetually renewed. If such astonishment is lacking, the whole enterprise of even the best theologian would canker at the roots. On the other hand, as long as even a poor theologian, I count myself among these, as long as even a poor theologian is capable of astonishment, he is not lost, she is not lost to the fulfillment of her task. She remains serviceable as long as the possibility is left open that astonishment might seize her like an armed man. I think this is a brilliant insight that can equally be applied to the arts, perhaps more so. As long as even poor artists are capable of astonishment, they are not lost to the fulfillment of their task. They remain serviceable as long as the possibility is left open that astonishment may seize them. There's a wonder at the heart of human existence that can overwhelm us at almost any moment, whether that's in the grandeur of the sky at night, the movement of the wind in the trees, the birth of a child, the smallest events witnessed in daily life. The Jewish philosopher Abraham Heschel called this radical amazement, an experience in which, as he said, we do not look at reality through the lattice work of our memorized knowledge, and in which nothing is taken for granted. Each thing is a surprise to us. We're gripped by the extraordinary nature of life and realize that there's something mysterious in what we encounter that remains tantalizingly beyond our grasp. Our radical amazement, says Heschel, responds to the mystery, but it doesn't produce it. The mystery is there. We didn't create it. Wonder is a critical dimension of art. It's very much a part of the human signature that is instantly recognizable to us. And it's there in abundance in the caves. That's part of their incredible appeal to contemporary viewers today, I think. When we look at these works, we know that they flow out of a profoundly human experience, And even now, 30,000 years later, they're able to renew and revitalize our own sense of the miracle of existence. The second characteristic feature, I think, of the human signature is the question that we are to ourselves. The question that we are to ourselves. However strange and mysterious the paintings and carvings may sometimes be, Upper Paleolithic art does give us an extraordinary glimpse into the inner life of these people. Some of the concerns they had, the questions they may have been asking, the awareness of themselves and the challenges they faced. To be human is to be aware of a question and the mystery at the heart of our existence. Who are we? What is a human being? The writer of Ecclesiastes describes our predicament with great accuracy. This is Ecclesiastes 3, verses 10 and 11. I've seen the burden God has laid on men and women. He's made everything beautiful in its time. He's also set eternity in their hearts, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. The burden God has laid on us, everything beautiful in its time, eternity in our hearts, yet we cannot fathom the meaning, the mystery from beginning to end. We come to consciousness in a wondrous, complex and stunningly beautiful cosmos, subject like everything else in creation to the possibilities and limitations of place and time. And yet, as so many writers and artists and thinkers over the centuries have recognized, including famously St. Augustine in his Confessions, we're a mystery to ourselves, aren't we? We scrutinize and study and explore the world around about us with great confidence, but we're unable to fathom the enigma, the mystery of our own lives. The art of the Upper Paleolithic is overwhelmingly an art of animals. Apart from the hands, there are very few human representations in Paleolithic art. Nevertheless, many scholars believe that this is art that is very much about the human struggle for meaning and identity. The artists see the animals in all their power and instinctive wisdom, and they're aware that we are not like them. There's a beauty in their completion, their adaptation to their environments. We, however, don't seem to fit in the same way. Very little comes to us by instinct. We need constantly to learn new things, to figure out solutions by trial and error and rational process. There is no natural state for human beings. To be human is to sense our incompleteness. But incompleteness doesn't necessarily imply a rebellion or a turning away from a former state. It's not necessarily sin. It can be a vivid sense that unlike the animals, we are not finished. We are not whole. We await our fulfillment. Abraham Heschel, in his great book, Who is Man?, writes this: it's a fatal illusion to assume that to be human is a fact given with human being, rather than a goal and an achievement. To animals, the world is what it is. To man, this is a world in the making. And human being means being on the way, striving, waiting, hoping. This is the brilliant and unavoidable possibility of humanity. There's something in our very makeup that makes us incapable of leaving the world unchanged. From the simplest stone tool to the greatest works of imagination, from a burial site to a complex city, human art and technology, religion and culture always involve some kind of rearrangement of the places and objects that make up our world. Our wholeness is never given, but has to be sought for, discovered, and received afresh. In this sense, human beings have always been living in an environmental crisis. We're deeply conscious of that at the moment, but in a sense, it's always been true. We've always been a danger to the ecosystems in which we find ourselves because we don't belong in the same way that the animals do. We have to find a way of being restless and responsible, discontent and devoted, longing and loving. From the very beginning, this is the human predicament. This is the challenge thrown down to us by life itself. It was for the artists of the Stone Age, and it's no different for us today. The problems have accumulated and become more acute, but they are in essence the same. What does it mean to be a human being? And the third characteristic of the human signature, responsibility. We've alluded to it already. A central part of the biblical vision of the image of God is the human calling to be the representative of God in the world. The call to be fruitful and multiply, to care and serve the garden, to cultivate the world. The earliest part of the Upper Paleolithic, the earliest art of the Upper Paleolithic was created tens of thousands of years before the invention of agriculture and the rise of settled communities. Indeed, it was created thousands of years before the revelation of Holy Scripture itself. And we might ask how this biblical vision relates to those hunter-gathering nomadic peoples at all. Gerardus van der Leeuw, the Christian Dutch theologian, in his book Sacred and Profane Beauty, says this: art is itself culture. It is like the hard work of the person who makes the world arable, who makes it his own world. Just as the farmer brings the land under cultivation, as the craftsman makes implements out of wood, stone, and similar materials which are at hand, as the man of science cultivates the kingdom of nature or the distant past or the activity of the human mind, so the artist recreates the world around him. He makes it arable, brings it under cultivation. Art is, in a very real sense, a kind of cultivation. In terms of Genesis 2, it's a serving of the garden, a tending and keeping of the world. Many millennia before the development of agriculture, the cave painters were already bringing the world under cultivation. That's what artists do. That's what Homo sapiens felt called upon to do from the beginning, and which the testimony of Scripture itself bears witness to. Whatever the precise nature of the religion that was practiced in the caves, the sense that sacred presence and power was being invoked or sought in these images is unavoidable. And yet it's something that often seems to be ignored or simply dismissed in contemporary Western conversations about the continuing significance of cave art. There's a very influential belief championed by a number of the scholars that I've been citing, including David Lewis Williams, that the religious aspect of this early art, like all religious belief, in fact, is simply the outworking of internal processes of our nervous system, a product of evolution. So in this view, the brain automatically generates concepts of gods and powers and spirits in an attempt to control our environment. Lewis Williams says this: the essential elements of religion are thus wired into the brain and therefore have no substance, no reality. What is in our heads is in our heads, not located beyond us. This is the crux of the matter, and it doesn't diminish Bach, Shakespeare, John Donne, or William Wordsworth, or the wonder of Upper Paleolithic art. Well, I think it does. I think it fails to do justice to the profound questions, ideas, thoughts, and emotions that are at the heart of universal human experience. Whatever is going on in the chemistry of the brain, the question, who am I? What am I? What does it mean to be a human? Is real. It's an enduring one, which isn't at all diminished by a more modern understanding of the brain, neurobiological processes. The question of the meaning of our existence can't be swatted away by such materialistic reductionism. When we discover a cave like Peshmerl or Lascaux or Chavy, our breath is certainly taken away by the beauty of the art. But that's only a part of it, and maybe only a small part. We are blown away by the we're blown away by the recognition that these works were made by people just like us. Their sense of wonder, their quest for meaning, and their longing to experience life in its very fullest material and spiritual expression. And I think this connects us across an almost unimaginable chasm of time, reminds us that our humanity, our very existence, like theirs, demands an explanation other than the threadbare, limited, and inhuman reductionism of so much modern Western rationalism. But of course, it's not just secular intellectuals who can be dismissive of the sacred concerns of others. Here, I think we have to recognize a fault within the Christian church at times. An important book called The Everlasting People, the Christian art historian Matthew Milliner, I'll post a bibliography for you guys eventually, but he's an art historian who teaches at Wheaton College in the USA. He addresses the uncomfortable fact that on the whole, North American Christians have shown very little interest in and often utter contempt for the long histories and traditions of the peoples whose land they conquered and whom they displaced. And the same dynamics are obviously at work in British history, European history, British imperialistic ventures around the world. Milliner uses Chesterton's The Everlasting Man, especially this chapter on the caves, as a kind of jumping off point to help North American Christians take seriously and reevaluate the art, culture, and religious perspectives of indigenous peoples. That sense of generosity and brotherhood across the abyss of ages that G.K. Chesterton talk about, that's engendered by cave art, that certainly needs to be extended to contemporary peoples whose own cultures have been dismissed as primitive or even demonic. In conclusion, I think that Chesterton's assertion that art is the signature of man is important theologically and missionally, both in the secular West and in engagement with cultures across the world. In the final analysis, it's founded on the central conviction that the evidence gathered by archaeologists and anthropologists, and in particular, the evidence of the painted images on the rock face, they bear clear witness to the fundamental identity of their makers, men and women who are made in the image of God. These ancient works of art are signs of the presence of the Imago Dei in the caves. Thank you. I'm done. So back to you.
Thank you very much, Iwan, for the fascinating presentation, which underpins that humans do differ from animals in kind, and that art is the signature of man. You've clearly explained how symbolism is at the heart of human existence, and the unique ability of human is to create a world in the mind and outside through art, and that we human are alone in the universe with the ability to contemplate about ourselves, our existence, and our life, to reflect on beauty and vibrancy of life. And you also said that art represents a move away from utility and work to freedom and grace, as contrast to the development of tools and industry, and that art is not done as an activity of leisure, but as an expression of life. You somehow connected it with Ruah, which is the breath of God, the spirit manifested in and through arts, which are sacred. And you also clearly explained how the sacred power symbolized by the drawing or print of hands is the first human signature, which is connected to specific persons or people, which you have shown through in your pictures, you know, the images that you have shown to us, and that this print, the hands, is somewhat connected to the desire for control, to subject it to somewhat to our will, and to engage with the world through our hand, leaving our mark, something that makes us different from the animals. And so human spirituality is, this hands is, you know, the art, the ability to create is also depict human spirituality, but also covetousness and arrogance. And you have brought out 3 points where you talked about astonishment, human ability to be astonished, to wonder at the heart of human existence, at smallest event in ordinary human existence, which is depicted through arts. And you talked about the question that human asks ourselves, awareness of ourselves. What does it mean to be human? And to reflect upon it. And the third point that you brought was responsibility, the call to be representative of God in the world. And you clearly explained and illustrated how the sacredness is present in the caves where these drawings, the Paleolithic drawings, are to be found. There is a sacred presence in there, and that human and depict, and though that essence depict the Imago Dei concept that we find in Christian theology. So thank you very much. And now I will open the floor to the other participants. And if you have any questions and comments to make, please raise your hand by using and pressing the button. Yes, first, okay, Tim, we have Tim.
I can't resist talking about this. In the G.K. Chesterton book, when he talks about the priest and the boy, he talks about how they went down deep into the ground. And he said that they went deep into the ground and found caves drawn by men. Animals drawn by men. But they'd have had to have dug a great deal deeper before they found men drawn by animals. And it kind of points out the absurdity of simply equating animals with humans. I thought that was brilliant, a very Chestertonian way of putting it. I was so pleased you appealed to that chapter.
Thank you very much. I mean, he's such a great writer, Chesterton, and I confess that I've not really paid a lot of attention to him. It was really through the discovery of cave art that I discovered this book, actually. And the fact that Chesterton wanted to begin his Christian apologetic there, I think there's something really striking about that. And as I think Matthew Milliner in his recent book kind of suggests, is only just out, by the way, but I think it's got, in terms of Western thinkers, extended generosity to these images and an interpretation to them, which hasn't always been the case, and isn't the case now among among certain kind of interpretations of indigenous art around the world. And so I think there's an implication there that Milliner pulls out that is quite important too.
We had a candidate. He may or may not join OCMS because they've still got this selection panel to go. But he wants to look at the way partly Chesterton, but I think he's thinking more of Tolkien and Lewis, how they use fantasy, how fantasy can be a way of communicating in a missionary context in the postmodern world. And of course, it's the point about fairy and things like that is the ability to induce wonder, and that's what you're saying is a natural faculty of human beings. It's this sense of wonder is just simply part of our humanness, and this is in fact something that bypasses our cynicism.
Indeed. I mean, when I was working at the BBC, I had many colleagues who were atheists. We had long conversations about religion. That was the topic they always wanted to bring up, which is kind of interesting. But I remember one guy talking to me about the fact that he didn't believe. He couldn't, he wasn't a believer of any kind. He was an atheist, and yet at the birth of his first child, he just wanted to give thanks. But to whom? To what? It really is something that, I think we can build on. Actually, these basic things, thanksgiving, wonder, they are things that really do connect us pretty quickly to God. I think it's interesting what you say about the link with Lewis and Tolkien. I mean, I was fascinated in North America, and still am, by the obsession that you find in Christian circles, evangelical circles over there, particularly with Tolkien and Lewis, who are drawing on the ancient mythologies of Greece, the Nordic countries, the Celtic fringe, my part of the world. So and clearly taking myth seriously in that context. It was a massive dimension of the thinking of both Lewis and Tolkien, and part of their reason for being Christians, actually. But some of these very same people in North America were the most rigid and the most hostile in actually encouraging conversation about the religions, the practices, the traditions of First Nations peoples. And, so I think Matthew Millen is definitely onto something here. There's something really important here.
Yes, thank you. David Nacho, I see your hand.
Hi, Iwan. It's so good to see you after a few years.
Yes, good to meet you again.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. There's a few things that kind of blew my mind, especially the part where the possibility of actually animation having been done in the movement of the animals. It just kind of blows away theory about art and animation so much. But what I wanted to
go ahead. That observation has been made by a number of people, but particularly by Martin Scorsese. He wrote an essay about the image and the meaning of the image, and that this has obviously played a role in human history from the beginning. But he was just struck by how so many of these animal images are kind of cinematic. There's a movement of a whole herd across the wall of the cave. It's really fascinating. And then another art historian called John Berger, he wrote an article for the Guardian newspaper shortly after. There were very few people who were allowed down there, but he went, and he said, it's incredible. This art, some of which is 35,000, 40,000 years old. It's like art was born like a foal, he said, not like a human baby. Because foals can get up and walk straight away. They're doing stuff. Right. They're doing all the great things that artists have ever done. There's perspective there. There's there's skill and sensitivity. It's all there. Sorry.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And talking about this explosion, right? This creative explosion, and a word that you use. I think it was exuberance of life coming out of life itself, and that part grabbed me quite a bit, because a big task of contextual Latin American theology has to do with doing theology out of life itself, right? And doing it in a sort of exuberant way, if you want. So I was thinking, like, out of I will get to a question, but I was just as a preamble. I was thinking. For instance, what do we miss when we lose the sense of astonishment, which is another word that you used? So what do we miss when we lose the sense of astonishment in our reading of biblical passages such as Genesis 1 or John 1? And we go to an analysis of them foremost, rather than following a sense of astonishment, at what is being described in the narrative of what is being portrayed in the narrative there. So I was thinking, like, theological education and the task of theology itself in the last couple of centuries has been modeled to has been shaped to respectably fit in the modern university, right? So what happens to theology when you make it dialogue, or when you shape it around a conversation with other threads of human knowledge or human experience? What might theological education look like? And if it's not done, if it's not confined, or if our understanding of the task is not confined for the theology to fit in in the modern university, but rather in the Arts Academy or something like that, what would it look like? And I wonder if you've taken some steps in that direction, or even if you've ever dreamt about that. So what could it look like?
Well, I mean, I got to say that art is important. I love Regent College because it has, as part of its Master of Arts in Theology, an arts dimension. You can do theology in the arts. So I think that's, that's a sign. But I think what you're talking about is the abiding temptation of theology, isn't it? Maybe it's the abiding temptation of human beings throughout time, actually, to take a relationship that matters and freeze it into an ideology, make it into something just dead. I mean, so when Barth talks about astonishment, if it's missing, everything's missing. It cankers at the roots, And I think that is our abiding temptation. Is it always the case? We always want to make, the gospel into something that we can package and freeze and, present to people as though we got it all taped. It's not, because God isn't that. God cannot be that, ever be that. Of course, the gospel is something we want to proclaim, and there are, there's the kerygma, and that matters deeply. But, how does it work out in life? It's got to be a deeply relational, existential thing. The arts, because that phrase about responding to life, itself, seeing something in life, responding with another creation that's what the human calling is, I think. That's what we're, that from the beginning, I think human beings have been artists. That's what, I think, the word for technology is obviously related to the same word as art, isn't it? Techne. And, our technology is not a million miles removed from art. Why not? Because it takes imagination to produce a tool and to think of the scientific theory. Imagination is absolutely critical to our humanity. But if imagination just gets pushed out of the way and everything becomes technicized, rationalized, the kind of stuff that Jacques Ellul is talking about in so many of his writings, then, we're on a profoundly inhuman path. I think that Chesterton, in driving at art as the signature of man, is saying something of profound importance right across the board, not just for cave art, but for the way we think about our lives, the way we think about culture.
Yeah, thank you, John Patwick.
Thank you very much, Ewan. Thank you for those marvelous pictures. There's some pictures there that I want to blow up and put on my wall. I don't know whether you've come across some of the thinkers who try to understand development. Who try to understand the development of consciousness in stages, the evolution of consciousness.
Yeah.
Like Jean Gebser, Owen Barfield, who was, of course, also one of the Inklings,
yeah.
And more recently Ken Wilber, although he's been taken up very much by New Age thinking. But the idea that there are periods of structures of consciousness, and that then the way in which we perceive the world, the way in which we understand the world shifts and changes. And there's another period, another form of structure of consciousness which will generally rule until the next change takes place. I must say, I think it really interesting myself. And Jean Gebser would probably locate what you have been describing, the art of the Upper Paleolithic, as archaic or magic structures of consciousness. And he doesn't intend to suggest that our structures of consciousness improve, but that they expand to some extent, or they become more sophisticated, but it's not a moral improvement. And he also feels that we need to have access to earlier structures of consciousness. In fact, that in ourselves we do have the capacity to do that, because it's part of being a human being. And so that in that sense, by looking, by being present, by looking at the cave paintings, by being present, as it were, before the cave paintings, maybe in a sense we can recapture something of that early structure of human consciousness, and learn from it. It's just a thought, really.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't know anything real. I mean, I know of Barfield. I don't know his work, I'm ashamed to say. I'm quite a poor academic, really. But I tell you, I think what you've put your finger on there is why Chesterton thinks this art is still important. By confronting ourselves with it, we are inevitably confronted with a recognition of something about ourselves that perhaps we're missing. I think that's why you want to put this stuff on your wall now. There's something, oh yeah, that is, that's it. It's nailed something about my sense of being in the world, of the beauty of the world, but also the kind of, the distance there is from certain realities as well. We're confronted with mystery, I think, and I think these different stages, however you see them, if any of them is lacking in astonishment or mystery or wonder, we've gone astray somewhere or other. So recapturing it through these paintings is a fantastic thing.
Yeah, thank you. Damon?
Yes, thank you for reminding me or reminding us of the needs to be astonished by God and his creation. Sometimes we take things for granted. We take God's creation for granted, or we take ourselves for granted. We are mystery. And I wonder, sometimes we even take the Bible for granted because we have studied so much, we think we know it, but we don't.
Yeah.
And Karl Barth certainly talks about the superabundance of God. He did not only use the word abundance, but superabundance of God, which certainly should surprise us, amaze us, and thank you for reminding us, of this important truth. And hopefully we can be amazed again by God's creation and by God himself, and try to imitate his creativity. His creativity is infinite. I watched the BBC series on the universe recently by Brian Cox. Talks about the light traveling to us, has been traveling to us by billions of years. Light travels extremely fast, and it's traveled for billions of years. Look at the distance of the universe. I mean, we cannot be not amazed by God's super abundant creation. It's absolutely mind-boggling, and they're all under God's control, knowledge. Billions and billions and billions of stars out there, like the sun. Absolutely mind-boggling. And thank you for reminding us not to be complacent and familiar. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Damon. Ian, yes, I would also just like to join Damon in saying that we should not take things for granted, but we should always remember that God is in control, and not to forget to wonder at something, at a higher power, which is, higher and more powerful than us, beyond us. And I was relating to what you said about, there's no natural state to be human. We are not whole, but await our fulfillment. It is a goal and something to be achieved. So we're being on our way, striving, hoping, which is something in our very makeup of being human. And I think that this state of hoping, longing, striving is the opportunities for us to be astonished, to wonder at what God can do in our life and at God's presence. So I found what you said very meaningful and resonates with what I understand God to be, that he's everywhere, powerful, beyond our understanding. So I just wanted to thank you, and I see no other hands that have been raised. And so if you have anything to add, Iwan.
I don't. It's been great to be with you, and thanks for your questions, observations. Marina, your summary of my lecture it was better than my lecture. So you know, shove a couple of pictures in that would have been fine. Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. It's been really good to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much. And with that, we end this afternoon session, which has been really fascinating and really interesting. Yeah, thank you very much. And I look forward to receiving your script, Iwan. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And we will